The wind whispered through the dense trees as Harper gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white in the dim glow of the dashboard. The road she'd taken wasn't on the map, a cracked, winding path that seemed to coil endlessly into the black void of the forest. Her phone had no signal. The gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. Harper's stomach churned as she remembered the old man at the gas station muttering something she hadn't quite caught when she asked for directions. "People don't come back from there," he'd said, though she brushed it off as local lore. Now, miles deep into the unknown, she regretted her arrogance. The headlights cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but skeletal trees and a road that seemed to narrow the further she drove. Then, her heart stopped. Up ahead, a sign loomed, rusted and tilted. "Welcome to Black Ridge." It wasn't a town she'd seen on the map. Harper slowed the car, squinting through the fog. The sign was riddled with bullet holes, the paint peeling like dead skin. Beneath it, scrawled in what looked disturbingly like dried blood, were the words, "Turn back now." Her rational mind screamed to reverse, to take the warning seriously, but the fuel gauge blinked its final warning. She had no choice but to press on. The first building she saw was a dilapidated gas station with shattered windows and a single, flickering neon light spelling "Shh, open." Harper hesitated but pulled in, her tires crunching on the gravel. The pumps were ancient, the hoses cracked and useless. She killed the engine and stepped out into the oppressive silence. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the thick night. A faint shuffling sound came from inside the station. Harper froze, her breath shallow. It didn't sound like footsteps. It was irregular, dragging. Against her better judgment, she pushed the door open. A bell jingled weakly above her. Inside, the air was stale and rank. Shelves were overturned, their contents spilled across the floor. A figure hunched behind the counter, a man in filthy overalls, his back to her. His shoulders jerked in strange, unnatural movements. "Excuse me, sir?" Harper said, her voice trembling. The man turned slowly, and Harper's stomach clenched. His face was a patchwork of scars, his lips stretched into a grotesque grin that revealed yellowed teeth. His eyes, milky and unblinking, locked onto her. "You lost?" he rasped, his voice like gravel. "I just need gas," she stammered, taking a step back. He chuckled, a wet, choking sound. "Ain't no gas here, but you can stay." Before she could respond, the lights flickered and died, plunging the station into darkness. Harper fumbled for her phone, its weak flashlight casting a shaky beam. When she turned it toward the counter, the man was gone. Her pulse thundered as she backed toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The bell above it tinkled, though no wind stirred. Panic clawed at her chest. Then she heard it. The dragging sound again, closer this time. She whipped around, her flashlight catching a figure crawling on all fours from the shadowy aisle. It wasn't the man. It was something else. Its limbs grotesquely long, its mouth a gaping maw lined with jagged teeth. It let out a guttural growl and lunged. Harper screamed, scrambling backward and crashing into the shelves. She bolted through a side door, finding herself in a narrow hallway lined with flickering fluorescent lights. The air reeked of decay. Behind her, the creature's claws scraped against the floor, its growls growing louder. She sprinted down the hallway, her lungs burning, and burst through another door. She was outside again, but not in the lot. She was in a clearing surrounded by trees. The gas station was gone. The forest pressed in on her from all sides. The trees gnarled and twisted as if in agony. Harper spun in circles, disoriented. Then she saw them, dozens of figures emerging from the shadows. Some crawled, others stumbled on broken limbs. All of them stared with empty eyes, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and hunger. She backed away, her foot catching on something soft. She looked down and gagged. A decaying corpse, its chest cavity hollowed out, its face twisted in terror. A low, guttural voice echoed from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." Harper turned, and the man from the station was standing there, his grin impossibly wide, his eyes glinting with malice. Around him, the figures began to close in, their mouths opening in unison to release an inhuman wail. Harper ran. Branches tore at her clothes and skin, but she didn't stop. The screams followed her, growing louder, closer. She tripped, tumbling down an embankment and landing hard on the cold ground. Dazed, she looked up to see her car, right where she'd left it. She scrambled to her feet, her body screaming in protest, and threw herself into the driver's seat. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. She tore down the road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. When she finally emerged from the forest, the sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the empty highway. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Her phone buzzed to life, displaying a single notification: "Welcome back to Black Ridge." Harper's scream echoed as the road ahead twisted, leading her back into the trees, and the town waited.
Story number 2.
The rumble of the engine faded into the distance as James and Claire stood in the gravel lot, the trailhead sign looming over them. "Darkwood Forest Hiking Trail. Enter at your own risk," it read in faded red letters. "Charming," Claire muttered, adjusting her backpack. James chuckled nervously. "It's just for dramatic effect. People overreact about these places." The stories surrounding Darkwood Forest were endless: disappearances, strange lights, whispers that followed hikers in the dead of night. But James had insisted. "A weekend in nature," he'd said. Claire had reluctantly agreed, though now, standing at the edge of the trail, a chill settled over her. The sun was high as they ventured deeper into the forest. Towering trees blocked much of the light, casting dappled shadows that danced on the ground. The air was thick, the silence oppressive. Hours passed and the trail grew more rugged. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing. A wooden cabin stood at its center, its windows dark and empty. James frowned. "This isn't on the map." Claire hesitated. "Maybe we should go back." A sharp creak interrupted her. The cabin door swung open, revealing a gaping darkness. "Probably just the wind," James said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. "Let's keep moving," Claire urged, her unease growing. But James was already walking toward the cabin. It might have supplies or something useful. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and rot. Dust motes floated in the faint light filtering through cracks in the walls. A single wooden table stood in the center, its surface covered in scratches. On the far wall, a large mirror hung crookedly, its surface fogged and stained. "This place gives me the creeps," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. James approached the mirror, his reflection distorted and wavering. He reached out to wipe the surface, and the room suddenly felt colder. Claire stepped closer, and as she glanced at the mirror, her stomach dropped. Their reflections were wrong. James's image was grinning, but he wasn't. His reflection's head tilted unnaturally, the grin widening until it split his face. Claire's reflection, though still, seemed to tremble faintly, its eyes darting to something behind her. "James," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. Before he could respond, the door slammed shut. The cabin plunged into darkness, the air thick with an overwhelming silence. Then came the whispers. Low and guttural, they seemed to come from everywhere at once. Words too distorted to understand filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. "Who's there?" James yelled, his voice cracking. A loud crash echoed from the corner of the room. Claire's phone light flickered on, illuminating the table. A figure crouched on it, impossibly thin, its joints twisted at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed faintly, pinpoints of light in its gaunt, hollow face. Claire screamed as the figure lunged, its limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions. She grabbed James's arm, yanking him toward the door. It wouldn't budge. The whispers became deafening, surrounding them, suffocating them. "Help us," a voice rasped from the shadows, followed by a chilling laugh. James threw himself at the door, and it splintered under his weight. They stumbled out into the clearing, gasping for air. The forest was eerily still, the sunlight dim and cold. "Run," Claire said, her voice trembling. They sprinted down the trail, the cabin disappearing behind them, but no matter how far they ran, the forest seemed endless. The trees twisted unnaturally, the path doubling back on itself. "Something's wrong," James panted, skidding to a halt. Claire turned, her heart sinking. The clearing was ahead of them again, the cabin standing exactly where they'd left it. "No," Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. From the cabin, the door creaked open. The gaunt figure stepped out, its head cocked to the side as it watched them. More shapes emerged from the shadows, figures like the first, their limbs twitching, their glowing eyes fixed on the pair. "They don't want us to leave," James muttered, his voice barely audible. The creatures advanced, their movements slow but deliberate. Claire grabbed James's hand. "We keep running." They plunged into the trees again, the whispers following them. As night fell, the forest grew darker, the air colder. The trail was gone, replaced by uneven ground that tripped them with every step. Claire stumbled, falling hard. When she looked up, James was gone. "James!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the woods. The whispers surrounded her again, closer this time. She turned in circles, her flashlight darting between the trees. Shadows flickered at the edges of the light, too many to count, and then she saw him. James stood a few feet away, his back to her. "James," she called, her voice shaking. He turned slowly, and Claire's blood ran cold. His face was wrong, stretched and twisted, his eyes glowing faintly like the creature's. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a guttural growl escaped. Claire turned and ran, tears blinding her. She didn't stop until she burst into a small clearing, her legs giving out beneath her. Ahead, a figure stepped into view. It was herself. Her doppelganger stared back, its face pale and empty. It raised a hand, pointing behind Claire. She turned, and the creatures were there, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. The last thing she heard was the sound of her own scream, swallowed by the shadows.
Story number 3.
The old farmhouse sat at the edge of a sprawling field, its windows dark and lifeless. Abby regretted coming the moment she saw it, but when her uncle passed, someone had to sort through his belongings. She drew a shaky breath and stepped inside, the creak of the wooden floorboards echoing through the silence. The air was heavy with mildew and something else, something sour. She wrinkled her nose and flipped the light switch. Nothing. The power must have been cut long ago. Abby clicked on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. Dust hung thick in the air, settling on furniture shrouded in yellowed sheets. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the old rug beneath her. The house felt wrong, not just abandoned, angry. In the kitchen, she found a stack of unopened letters and a note scrawled in her uncle's familiar, jagged handwriting. "Do not go into the cellar. Do not listen to the voices." Her stomach churned as she stared at the words. Her uncle had always been a little eccentric, but this was beyond his usual quirks. Abby folded the note and shoved it into her pocket, telling herself it was just paranoia. As the hours passed, she boxed up his belongings, each creak of the house setting her nerves on edge. By nightfall, she'd only scratched the surface. She decided to stay overnight. Leaving in the dark didn't seem any better than staying. But sleep didn't come easily. The bed in the upstairs guest room was hard and cold, and every time she closed her eyes, the house seemed to shift. The wind outside whistled faintly, but it wasn't the wind that woke her at midnight. It was a voice. Faint at first, a soft murmur rising from beneath the floorboards. Abby froze, her heart pounding. She strained to listen, but the sound stopped. She told herself it was her imagination and pulled the blanket over her head. But as the minutes dragged on, the voice returned, this time louder. "Help me," it whispered, faint and childlike. Abby's blood turned to ice. She sat up, clutching the flashlight. The sound was coming from below her, the cellar. She debated calling someone, but who? The sheriff would think she was crazy. Besides, she didn't even have a cell signal out here. The voice came again, pleading. "Help me, please." Against every instinct, Abby slid out of bed. Her feet hit the icy floor, and the boards groaned beneath her weight. She gripped the flashlight tightly as she descended the stairs. The cellar door stood at the far end of the hallway. It was locked, a heavy iron bolt securing it shut. Abby's hand shook as she slid the bolt back. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that plunged into darkness. The air that rushed out was damp and cold, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The only response was the soft, distant sound of weeping. Abby descended the stairs, her flashlight illuminating the crumbling stone walls. The cellar was larger than she expected, the shadows stretching endlessly. "Is someone down here?" she asked, her voice echoing. The weeping stopped. Silence pressed against her, so thick it was suffocating. She turned, the beam of her flashlight catching a figure at the edge of the light, a child crouched in the corner, their face hidden in their hands. Abby's heart clenched. "Hey, it's okay," she said, stepping closer. "I'll help you." The child didn't move. She knelt down, reaching out a trembling hand. "Are you hurt?" The child's hands dropped slowly, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. Its skin was smooth and featureless, its mouth a jagged tear that split open into a scream. Abby stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from her hand. Darkness swallowed her, and in that darkness the whispers began again, louder, harsher, coming from all around her. "Stay with us," they hissed. "Don't leave." Something cold brushed against her ankle, and she screamed, scrambling to her feet. She grabbed the flashlight, its beam flickering as she swung it wildly. The cellar was alive with movement now, shadows slithering, shapes darting just out of view. Abby ran, her breath ragged. She found the stairs and bolted up them, slamming the cellar door behind her. She slid the bolt into place and backed away, her chest heaving. The whispers didn't stop. They seeped through the wood, curling around her like smoke. "You can't leave," they crooned. Abby grabbed her car keys and fled, her flashlight shaking in her grip. As she reached the front door, the whispers turned to laughter, low and guttural, echoing in her ears. She threw open the door and sprinted to her car. The engine roared to life, and she sped down the dirt road, her hands trembling on the wheel. When she glanced in the rearview mirror, the farmhouse stood dark and silent. But in the upper window, a figure watched her, a face smooth and blank, its mouth split into a grin. She didn't stop driving until the sun rose, but even then, the whispers lingered. That night, back in her apartment, she found something in her pocket. The note from her uncle. Beneath the original warning, new words had appeared, scrawled in frantic handwriting. "They never let me leave." Abby dropped the note, her hands shaking. From the corner of the room, a faint voice called out, soft and childlike. "Help me, please."
Story number 4.
The bus sputtered to a stop on the lonely stretch of highway, its headlights casting feeble beams into the pitch-black night. Lila glanced at the driver, an older man with deep-set eyes and a haunted expression. "This is the last stop," he said, his voice gravely. "What? This isn't anywhere near Ridgefield," Lila protested, clutching her backpack. The driver didn't respond. He simply stared at her through the rearview mirror, his gaze hollow. "We don't go further than this after dark. You'll want to keep walking, but don't talk to them." Lila frowned. "Talk to who?" The driver's lips pressed into a thin line as he motioned for her to step off the bus. The door wheezed shut behind her, and the vehicle rumbled back into motion, leaving her in a cloud of exhaust. She stood alone on the cracked asphalt, her only company the towering trees that lined the road. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears. She glanced at her phone, no service. Her flashlight barely penetrated the darkness as she began walking, her footsteps crunching against the gravel shoulder. The forest on either side of her seemed alive, branches twisting and groaning in the faint wind. After a few minutes, she noticed something strange. A figure up ahead, standing at the edge of the road. It was a man, but his posture was unnatural, his head tilted too far to one side, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Excuse me," Lila called hesitantly. "Do you know how far Ridgefield is?" The man didn't move. "Hello?" She tried again, stepping closer. As the flashlight's beam reached him, her stomach churned. The man's face was pale, almost translucent, his eyes milky and unfocused. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. Lila backed away, her heart pounding. The man moved suddenly, his neck snapping upright as his head swiveled unnaturally to face her. His mouth opened, impossibly wide, but no sound came out. "Don't talk to them," the driver's warning echoed in her mind. Lila turned and broke into a sprint. The road stretched endlessly ahead, her breathing ragged in the suffocating silence. She didn't dare look back, but the faint sound of shuffling footsteps followed her, slow and deliberate. She spotted another figure on the roadside. A woman this time, crouched low with her hands covering her face. Lila's instincts screamed at her to keep running, but the woman began to sob, a dry, hollow sound that didn't seem entirely human. Against her better judgment, Lila slowed. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking. The woman froze. Her hands fell away, revealing a face devoid of features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin. Lila stumbled back with a scream as the woman's head tilted, her featureless face aiming directly at her. From behind, the footsteps grew louder. She bolted, her legs burning with every step. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing closer to the road. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. A sign loomed ahead, rusted and bent. "Welcome to Ridgefield." Relief surged through her, but it was short-lived. The town was dark, its streets deserted. She ran toward the nearest building, a diner with flickering neon lights. She burst inside, gasping for air. The interior was silent, the booths empty. A single man sat at the counter, his back to her. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need help. Something's out there." The man didn't turn. He sipped his coffee slowly, his movements mechanical. "Sir?" she pressed, stepping closer. He swiveled toward her, and Lila's blood ran cold. His face was distorted, his features melting and reforming like wax. His mouth opened and a low, garbled sound escaped, like static on an old radio. The door behind her creaked open. Lila turned to see them, figures pouring into the diner, their pale faces blank and lifeless. The man at the counter stood, his head tilting unnaturally as he joined the others. They surrounded her, their movements slow but relentless. She backed away, her body trembling. "Stay back!" They didn't stop. One of them raised a hand, its fingers too long, the joints bending backward. It touched her shoulder, and a cold like she'd never felt before seeped into her skin. Her vision blurred. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was her own reflection in the diner's window, her face pale and blank, her eyes milky and unblinking. Somewhere down the road, the bus stopped again, its engine idling. "Last stop," the driver muttered to the lone passenger. "Where's Ridgefield?" they asked nervously. The driver's gaze flickered to the road ahead. "You'll want to keep walking, but don't talk to them."
Story number 5.
It started with a wrong turn. Kevin had been driving all night, his GPS flickering in and out of service. The dense forest around him seemed endless, the same gnarled trees whipping past his car windows. When the GPS lost signal again, he took the first turn he saw, desperate to find a main road. The road narrowed, the pavement cracked and overgrown with weeds. Kevin slowed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His headlights barely pierced the thick fog that had settled in. The trees leaned closer to the road, their branches gnarled like skeletal hands. After what felt like hours, he realized something was wrong. The road never curved, never widened, never ended. Just a straight, suffocating stretch of asphalt flanked by shadows. Kevin checked his phone. No signal. He turned on the radio, hoping for news or music, anything to break the oppressive silence. Static. Then, faintly, a voice broke through. "Turn around," it whispered, barely audible over the crackling. Kevin's chest tightened. He adjusted the dial, but the voice was gone. Just static again. He glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road, far behind his car. It was tall and thin, its silhouette stark against the fog. "Where the hell did you come from?" Kevin muttered, his voice trembling. He pressed the gas pedal harder, his car accelerating down the endless road. When he dared to look in the mirror again, the figure was gone, or so he thought. A tap, soft but deliberate. It came from the back window. Kevin's stomach dropped. He refused to look. Tap, tap. The sound was louder now, more insistent. "Leave me alone," he whispered, gripping the wheel tighter. The tapping stopped. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. The radio crackled back to life, and this time the voice was louder. "You can't run from us, Kevin." His breath hitched. "Who's there? How do you know my name?" No response. The static swallowed the voice again. Kevin's knuckles turned white as he sped down the road. He glanced at the dashboard clock. The glowing numbers read 2:47 a.m. He checked again minutes later. Still 47 a.m. Time wasn't moving. "This isn't happening," he muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." Up ahead, something lay sprawled across the road. Kevin slammed the brakes, his car skidding to a stop. The headlights illuminated a deer, its body twisted unnaturally, its glassy eyes staring directly at him. As he sat frozen, the deer twitched. Its head jerked upward, and its mouth opened wide, far too wide. A guttural scream erupted from the creature, a sound that didn't belong in this world. Kevin threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as he backed away. The road behind him was no longer empty. Figures emerged from the fog, dozens of them. They moved in unison, their heads tilted unnaturally to one side. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. Kevin's heart pounded as he spun the wheel, turning the car back toward the deer. But it was gone. The road ahead was clear. He floored the gas pedal, the car roaring down the endless stretch of asphalt. The figures didn't chase him, but their presence lingered in the fog, shadows flickering at the edges of his vision. The radio crackled again. "You can't escape, Kevin. You're already ours." The voice was louder now, more distinct. It sounded like his own. "No!" he shouted, slamming his hand against the dashboard. "Leave me alone." Ahead, the road began to curve. Relief washed over him, finally a sign he was getting somewhere. But as he rounded the bend, his blood turned cold. He was back where he started. The same stretch of road, the same trees, the same fog, and standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights, was himself. The figure was identical to him, down to the terrified expression frozen on its face. Kevin slammed the brakes, but it was too late. The car passed through the doppelganger, which dissolved into the fog like smoke. Kevin's vision blurred, his head spinning. The radio crackled one final time. "Welcome home." The car sputtered and died, leaving him in silence. The headlights flickered off, plunging him into darkness. Kevin sat there, gripping the wheel, his breaths shallow and ragged. In the distance, the figures began to emerge again, their glowing eyes piercing the fog. This time, they were closer, and they were smiling.
Story number 6.
Claire moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, eager for a fresh start. The house had character, she told herself. Creaky wooden floors, grand archways, and a massive antique mirror mounted in the hallway. The mirror was the first thing that caught her attention when she moved in. It was beautiful, but unnerving, its gilded frame adorned with intricate carvings of twisting vines and hollow-eyed faces. The surface was slightly tarnished as though it had seen things better left unseen. Still, Claire decided to keep it. She convinced herself it was just an antique, nothing more. For the first few nights, everything seemed fine. She unpacked, settled in, and started to feel at home. But the house was old, and the noises were constant, groans of wood, whispers of wind, and sometimes something else. Claire noticed it the first time while brushing her teeth. She glanced up at the bathroom mirror, her reflection normal. But just beyond her, in the hallway, she caught a glimpse of something in the antique mirror. A figure, faint and blurry, standing still. She spun around, her heart racing, but the hallway was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. "It's just my imagination," Claire muttered, shaking her head. She went to bed, determined to ignore the chill creeping up her spine. But the mirror didn't let her forget. Over the next few days, Claire noticed more strange reflections. A shadow flitting behind her as she passed the hallway. A flicker of movement that shouldn't have been there. One night, she stood in front of the mirror, staring into its depths. Her own reflection stared back, but something about it was off. Her reflection blinked. Claire didn't. She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The reflection didn't move with her. It smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched too wide. Claire bolted to her room and locked the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of her reflection stepping out of the mirror, its grin never fading. The next morning, she decided to cover the mirror. She threw a heavy sheet over it, ignoring the faint whispers that seemed to emanate from beneath the fabric. That night, the whispers grew louder. Claire woke to the sound of something scratching. She sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. The sound was coming from the hallway. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping toward the door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty, except for the mirror. The sheet was gone. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her anymore. Its eyes were dark, hollow pits, and its grin was wider than ever. "Why are you doing this?" Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her reflection tilted its head as though amused. Then it raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. Claire's chest tightened as her own hand moved involuntarily, mimicking the reflection. Her palm met the cold surface of the mirror, and for a moment everything was still. Then the glass rippled like water, and the reflection's hand yanked her through. Claire screamed as the world twisted and darkened. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the hallway. But everything was wrong. The colors were muted, the air heavy and cold. She turned to the mirror and froze. Her reflection was staring at her from the other side, grinning triumphantly. It reached out, its movements no longer mimicking hers. It adjusted its hair, stretched its neck, and then walked away, out of view, into Claire's world. Claire pounded on the glass, her screams echoing in the silence. The mirror wouldn't break. Now, she's trapped, watching as the thing that wears her face lives her life. And sometimes at night, when it knows no one else is watching, it stands in front of the mirror and grins at her.
Story number 7.
It was a late October evening when David and his friends decided to cut through the old cornfield on their way home. The air was crisp, the scent of dried leaves and earth hanging thick. The shortcut was infamous. Locals called it cursed, but the boys laughed off the stories. They were just tales to keep kids away from the field, David thought. The corn stalks towered above them, swaying gently in the breeze. The narrow dirt path snaked through the field, and the fading sunlight cast eerie shadows between the rows. "Come on, it's just a field," Mark said, trying to sound braver than he felt. David wasn't so sure. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No rustling leaves, no distant hum of crickets, just silence. Too much silence. "Let's keep moving," David muttered, gripping the straps of his backpack tightly. Halfway through, they saw it. A scarecrow stood in the middle of the path, its frame ragged and weathered. Its head was a burlap sack with black buttons for eyes and a crooked, stitched smile. A battered hat rested on its head, tilted jauntily. "That wasn't here before," Jason whispered. "It's just a scarecrow," Mark said, though his voice wavered. David didn't respond. Something about the scarecrow felt wrong. Its head was cocked slightly, as if it were listening, and the smile seemed wider now. "Let's go around," David said, stepping off the path into the dense corn. The others followed, but the cornfield felt alive, the stalks brushing against them like grasping fingers. They stumbled through, rejoining the path several yards ahead. When they turned back, the scarecrow was gone. David's stomach dropped. "Where did it go?" Jason shook his head, his face pale. Maybe it fell over?" "Yeah, right," Mark said, though his bravado had all but vanished. "Let's keep moving," David urged. They picked up the pace, their footsteps crunching against the dry soil. Every so often, David glanced over his shoulder, convinced he saw movement in the corner of his eye, a figure slipping between the stalks, always just out of sight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness closed in around them. The flashlight David had brought barely lit the way, casting long, flickering shadows. Then they heard it. A soft rustling. Not from the wind, but from something moving. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice cracking. Silence. Then a low, raspy chuckle came from somewhere ahead. David's blood turned cold. He raised the flashlight, its beam trembling. The scarecrow stood at the edge of the path, closer now. Its head tilted sharply, and its stitched smile seemed impossibly wide. "That's not funny," Mark said, his voice trembling. "Who's doing this? Jason? Is it you?" "It's not me," Jason snapped. The scarecrow stepped forward. It didn't walk like a person. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet with broken strings. "Run," David whispered, his legs already moving. The boys tore down the path, the flashlight bouncing wildly in David's hand. The cornfield seemed endless, the stalks closing in on either side. Behind them, the scarecrow's laughter grew louder, closer. David dared to glance back. It was running now, its limbs bending in impossible ways, its button eyes glinting in the dark. "Go, go, go!" he screamed. Jason tripped, falling hard onto the dirt. David stopped, grabbing his friend's arm and pulling him up. The scarecrow was almost on them now, its stitched mouth stretching open, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. They burst out of the cornfield, stumbling onto the main road. The scarecrow stopped just at the edge of the field, its smile fading as it tilted its head. The boys didn't stop running until they were miles away, panting and shaking. When they finally dared to look back, the cornfield was still, the scarecrow gone. The next morning, the police found Mark's backpack at the edge of the field. The boys swore they'd never go back, but David couldn't shake the feeling that the scarecrow wasn't done. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it, the soft rustling of corn and a low, raspy chuckle just outside his window.
Story number 8.
It was supposed to be a weekend of camping and relaxation for Emily, Ryan, and their friends. They'd been looking forward to escaping the city, leaving their phones behind, and immersing themselves in the tranquility of nature. The Whispering Woods was a remote forest, miles from the nearest town. Locals often warned visitors about strange occurrences, but the group laughed off the stories as superstitions designed to keep tourists away. By the time they arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The dense trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches casting jagged shadows on the forest floor. "Let's set up camp here," Ryan suggested, pointing to a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The group pitched their tents and started a fire. Laughter filled the air as they roasted marshmallows and shared ghost stories. "I've got one," Emily said, leaning in closer to the firelight. "Ever hear about the Whispering Woods?" Ryan rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, not this nonsense." "No, listen," Emily insisted. "They say people hear whispers in the trees at night. If you follow them, you'll never come back." "Spooky," Sarah teased, throwing a marshmallow at her. But as the fire crackled and the night deepened, the forest grew eerily quiet. The laughter faded, replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They all strained their ears. At first, it was faint, a soft murmuring carried on the wind. "Probably just the wind," Ryan said, but his voice betrayed his unease. The murmurs grew louder, distinct. Emily felt her stomach twist. The whispers weren't random. They were words. "Come closer. Follow. This way. Who's out there?" Sarah called, her voice shaking. No answer, just the whispers, circling them like invisible predators. Ryan grabbed a flashlight. "I'll check it out. Probably some kids messing with us." "Ryan, don't." Emily grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. "I'll be right back." He disappeared into the trees, the beam of his flashlight bouncing between the trunks. The whispers grew louder. Then, a scream. Emily bolted to her feet. "Ryan!" No answer. Mark grabbed a lantern. "Stay here. I'll find him." He vanished into the woods, leaving the remaining three huddled by the dying fire. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. "Mark?" Sarah called, her voice cracking. Nothing. Emily's heart pounded as the whispers grew deafening, surrounding them. The words were clearer now. "Join us. Come closer. Don't be afraid." Suddenly, Sarah stood. Her eyes were glassy, her movements robotic. "Sarah?" Emily grabbed her arm. "What are you doing?" "They're calling me," Sarah said, her voice monotone. "No!" Emily yanked her back, but Sarah tore free, stumbling into the darkness. Emily and Jess were alone now. "We have to go," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. Emily nodded, grabbing her backpack and dousing the fire. They moved quickly, stumbling through the forest, the whispers chasing them. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustling leaf a harbinger of something worse. Jess suddenly stopped, her eyes wide. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Emily followed her gaze. Between the trees, faint figures moved, pale, ethereal shapes with hollow eyes. They glided silently, their mouths moving in unison, the source of the whispers. "Run!" Emily screamed, grabbing Jess's hand. They sprinted, branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The figures followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Emily tripped, falling hard onto the ground. When she looked up, Jess was gone. "Jess!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the forest. The figures closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on her. She scrambled to her feet, running blindly. Finally, she broke through the tree line, collapsing onto the side of the road. A passing car screeched to a halt, the driver rushing to her side. "Are you okay? What happened?" Emily could barely speak, her body trembling. "They're still out there," she whispered, pointing to the woods. The driver looked but saw nothing. Days later, search parties combed the forest. They found the campsite abandoned and untouched. Ryan, Mark, Sarah, and Jess were never seen again. Emily never returned to the Whispering Woods, but sometimes, late at night, she hears the whispers in her dreams. Come closer. Join us. Don't be afraid.
Story number 9.
The house had stood on the outskirts of town for decades, abandoned and weather-worn. Locals called it the Breathing House, a name whispered in hushed tones, though no one could say where the name originated. It was just one of those things everyone knew. When Mia and her friends stumbled across it during their road trip, they didn't heed the warnings. "It's just a stupid nickname," Logan said, Matana pushing the rusted gate open. The wind howled through the dead trees surrounding the property, but the house itself was silent, eerily so. Its windows were black and empty, its wooden frame sagging as though it could collapse at any moment. "I dare you to go inside," Jess teased, elbowing Mia. "Fine," Mia said, trying to sound braver than she felt. The group stepped onto the creaking porch, the boards bending under their weight. The front door swung open with a low groan, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. "It's just an old house," Logan said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "See? Nothing to worry about." But as they moved deeper into the house, something felt wrong. Mia froze in the hallway, her hand brushing against the peeling wallpaper. It was faint, but she could swear the walls were moving. She pressed her palm flat against the surface and gasped. It was warm. "Mia?" Jess called, snapping her out of her daze. "Nothing," Mia lied, pulling her hand back. They entered the living room, where an ancient couch sat facing a fireplace choked with ash. The floor was littered with debris, shards of glass, yellowed newspaper clippings, and a single child-sized shoe. "Creepy," Jess muttered, picking up the shoe. "Let's check upstairs," Logan suggested, already heading for the staircase. Reluctantly, they followed him, the stairs groaning under their weight. The second floor was darker, colder. The group split up to explore, their flashlights casting long, flickering shadows. Mia wandered into a bedroom. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, and a cracked vanity mirror stood in the corner. That's when she heard it, a faint rhythmic sound. Inhale, exhale. Her stomach churned. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her own breath. It was coming from the house itself. "Mia!" Jess's voice rang out from the hallway, startling her. Mia bolted out of the room, nearly colliding with Jess. "Did you hear that?" Jess whispered, her eyes wide. Before Mia could respond, Logan appeared at the top of the stairs. "Guys, come check this out." They followed him to a small door at the end of the hallway. It was ajar, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. "A basement?" Logan said, peering inside. "Let's not," Jess said, but Logan was already descending. The basement smelled worse than the rest of the house, like rot and decay. The walls were damp, the floor slick with some unidentifiable slime. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table. On it lay a journal, its cover cracked and stained. Logan flipped it open. The pages were filled with scribbled words, but one phrase was repeated over and over. "It breathes. It lives. It watches." A low, guttural noise filled the air, making the walls vibrate. Inhale. Exhale. The house was breathing. "Let's get out of here," Mia said, panic rising in her chest. Before they could move, the basement door slammed shut. The lights on their phones flickered and died, plunging them into complete darkness. "Logan?" Jess's voice trembled. "I'm right here," Logan said, but his voice was distant, as if he were moving away. "Logan, don't," Mia began, but the floor beneath her feet shifted. The house was alive. The walls pulsed, the floor writhed. Something wet brushed against Mia's leg, and she screamed, scrambling backward. Jess's voice was lost in the chaos as the breathing grew louder, more ragged. Inhale. Exhale. A gaping hole opened in the floor, revealing a churning mass of flesh and teeth. The house wasn't just alive, it was hungry. Mia ran, blindly clawing her way up the stairs. She heard Jess screaming behind her, but she didn't stop. When she reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. The walls around her convulsed as the house groaning in agony, or ecstasy. In a final act of desperation, Mia threw herself through a broken window, landing hard on the ground outside. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the sound of the house's breathing echoing in her ears. When she reached the road, she turned back. The house was still, its dark windows watching her. Logan and Jess were never seen again. Mia doesn't talk about what happened that night, but sometimes, when she's alone, she hears it. Inhale. Exhale. And she knows the house is still waiting.
Story number 10.
When Lena moved into her new apartment, it seemed perfect. It was small but cozy, with a view of the city skyline. The building was old, the kind that creaked and groaned in the wind, but Lena found the quirks charming at first. The front door had an antique keyhole below the deadbolt, the kind you could peer through. It didn't bother her. She figured it was just another relic of the building's age. The first few nights passed uneventfully. Then one evening, as Lena was getting ready for bed, she heard it, a soft knock on her door. She froze, her toothbrush halfway to her mouth. It was nearly midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? The knock came again, faint but deliberate. "Who is it?" Lena called, her voice shaking slightly. No answer. She tiptoed to the door, her heart pounding. Slowly, she bent down to peer through the keyhole. The hallway outside was dimly lit, and at first she saw nothing. But then, movement, a shadow passing across the keyhole, as though someone were standing just out of sight. Her throat tightened. "Hello?" she whispered. No response. She backed away from the door, her palms slick with sweat. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. The next day, Lena convinced herself it was just a prank. Maybe one of her neighbors had too much to drink. But the following night, it happened again. This time, the knock was softer, almost hesitant. Lena stared at the door, dread coiling in her stomach. She didn't want to look through the keyhole, but her curiosity got the better of her. She crouched down, pressing her eye to the small opening. The shadow was there again, larger this time, its edges sharp and angular. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything she could recognize. Then it moved closer. The shadow seemed to press against the other side of the keyhole, as though it knew she was watching. Lena gasped and fell backward, her hands shaking. "Go away," she screamed. The knocking stopped instantly. Lena barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and groan the building made. The next day, she told her landlord about the incidents. "Has anyone else complained about strange knocks?" she asked. The landlord frowned. "No, but that's not surprising. You're the only tenant on that floor." Lena felt a chill creep up her spine. She decided to stay with a friend for a few days, hoping the distance would clear her head. But when she returned, the knocking began again. This time, louder. She ignored it, clutching her blanket tightly in bed. But the sound grew insistent, as though the knocker knew she was inside. And then she heard it. A voice. Soft, raspy, and almost curious. Lena. Her blood ran cold. The thing knew her name. She wanted to run, to escape, but she was frozen in place. The knocking stopped, replaced by a scratching sound. It was coming from the keyhole. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Lena crept to the door and peered through. Her eye met something dark and pulsating, like a mass of shifting shadows. It stared back at her, though it had no eyes, and she felt an overwhelming sense of malice. Then it whispered, "Let me in." Lena screamed and scrambled back, grabbing her phone to call the police. When they arrived, the hallway was empty. No one had been outside her door. Lena moved out the next day, leaving behind her deposit and most of her belongings. She tried to forget about the apartment, but sometimes, late at night, she hears knocking on her new door. She never looks through the keyhole, and she never ever answers.
Story number 11.
The old forest road stretched endlessly, a winding path through the thick, ancient trees. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows that danced like skeletal fingers in the breeze. Jenna gripped the steering wheel of her aging sedan, the hum of the engine her only companion. The GPS on her phone had rerouted her hours ago due to a supposed shorter route, but the desolate road felt anything but efficient. She glanced at the screen again, its soft glow eerily out of place in the growing gloom. The signal bar was empty and the map was frozen. "Perfect," she muttered, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. Up ahead, a faded wooden sign emerged from the trees, its peeling paint barely legible in the dim light. "Black Hollow Trail, scenic route." The road forked, and her GPS blinked uselessly. Left or right? Jenna hesitated, then decided on instinct, veering left onto the narrower, less worn path. Gravel crunched under her tires, and the trees seemed to close in tighter, as though reluctant to let her pass. Minutes turned into an hour. The road became increasingly treacherous, riddled with potholes and overgrown with weeds. Jenna's nerves frayed as twilight dissolved into full darkness. Her headlights sliced through the black, illuminating only the suffocating forest. She hadn't seen another car or even a sign of life since she'd turned off. The first bump came suddenly, jarring her forward. She slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. Peering out the windshield, she saw nothing but the empty road ahead. But then she felt it, a subtle, deliberate rocking of the car. The sensation was too rhythmic to be the wind. Someone or something was pushing. Swallowing her fear, Jenna rolled down her window just enough to peek outside. The night was eerily quiet, save for the chirping of distant crickets. She called out, her voice shaky, "Hello, is someone there?" No response. The rocking stopped. She rolled the window back up quickly and locked the doors, her fingers trembling. Deciding to keep moving, Jenna pressed the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, only to jerk to a stop. It felt as though something had grabbed hold of the rear tires. The engine whined as she revved it, but the car wouldn't budge. Panicking, she stepped out, clutching a flashlight from the glove box. The beam cut through the dark as she rounded the back of the vehicle. Her breath hitched. Twisted vines, unnaturally thick and covered in thorns, had wrapped around the tires like constricting snakes. She had driven through nothing like this. As she bent closer, a rustling sound came from the woods to her left. Jenna froze, her heart thundering in her chest. The flashlight beam darted toward the source of the noise, illuminating only trees and undergrowth. Then came a low, guttural growl, deep, primal, and too close for comfort. She scrambled back into the car, locking the doors and frantically trying the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Tears welled in her eyes as she hit the steering wheel. "Come on! Come on!" The growling grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. Something large was moving toward her. Jenna gripped the flashlight, its narrow beam swinging wildly across the road. A pair of glowing eyes appeared, reflecting back at her from the tree line. They were too high off the ground to belong to any ordinary animal. The thing stepped into the light, and Jenna wished she hadn't looked. It was humanoid, but its limbs were grotesquely elongated, its skin pale and stretched tight over protruding bones. Its mouth was a jagged gash, lined with sharp, uneven teeth. It didn't walk so much as lurch, its movements jerky and unnatural like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Jenna's scream tore through the night as the creature lunged. She grabbed her phone, useless though it was, and hurled it at the thing. The impact didn't faze it. Claw-like fingers raked across the hood of her car, leaving deep gouges in the metal. In sheer desperation, Jenna reached for the keys and turned them again. This time, the engine roared to life. She slammed the car into reverse, the vines snapping as she floored it. The creature gave chase, its limbs flailing as it moved with horrifying speed. She didn't stop until she saw another road sign, a modern, reflective one pointing back to the highway. Jenna veered onto the paved road, her car rattling from the abuse it had endured. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror until she was miles away. When she finally pulled into a gas station, Jenna stumbled out of the car, her legs weak. The attendant looked up from his newspaper, raising an eyebrow. "You okay, miss?" Jenna opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She glanced at her car, now covered in scratches and streaked with mud. On the rear bumper, a single, thorn-covered vine clung stubbornly, as if to remind her of what lurked in Black Hollow. She left the vine where it was. Some things were better left untouched.